How does a woman's heart learn to beat again after the echo of her child's has faded into silence? For Dr. Eris Thorne, this was not a poetic question. It was a clinical reality, a physiological impossibility she inhabited every single day. Her own heart was a hollow, functional muscle, pumping blood through a life that had been drained of all its color, all its meaning. She moved through the sterile, white corridors of St. Jude's Pediatric Hospital like a ghost in a lab coat, her name a quiet murmur of respect and fear among the staff. She was, by all accounts, a brilliant physician, a diagnostician with an almost supernatural ability to see the subtle flaws in the tiny, fragile machines of children's bodies. But her hands, which could palpate a swollen liver with exquisite precision, could no longer offer a gesture of comfort. Her eyes, which could detect the faintest trace of cyanosis under fluorescent lights, no longer met the desperate gazes of the parents who looked to her as a god. Her own god had died a year, 2 months, and 11 days ago, on a sterile bed identical to the ones she now presided over, holding the hand of her 6-year-old son, Leo, as a fever of unknown origin stole the light from his eyes. The irony was a constant, bitter acid in her stomach. She, who had dedicated her life to saving children, could not save her own. Faith, for Eris, had become a malignant fantasy, a cruel fairy tale people told themselves to blunt the sharp, jagged edges of reality. She had once been a believer. She had prayed, not with the casual habit of tradition, but with the fierce, bargaining love of a mother. She had knelt on the cold linoleum floor of the hospital chapel, her own colleagues working frantically down the hall, and offered the universe anything and everything in exchange for her son's life. She offered her career, her health, her own breath. The universe, in its infinite, cold indifference, had refused the trade. The silence that met her prayers was the most profound and definitive answer she had ever received. And so she had methodically excised her faith like a tumor, cutting it out with the clean, sharp scalpel of her grief. What remained was science, data, the measurable and the observable. Hope was a variable she could not quantify, a placebo that offered false comfort while the disease continued its relentless march. She saw it now in the faces of the parents who sat by their children's bedsides, clutching rosaries and whispering prayers. She saw it as a form of denial, a refusal to accept the cold, hard numbers on the monitors. She would deliver her diagnoses with a calm, brutal honesty, her voice a flat, unemotional instrument, stripping away their fragile hope because, in her mind, it was a kindness to prepare them for the inevitable silence she knew so well. Her colleagues walked on eggshells around her. They remembered the old Eris, the one whose laughter used to echo in the cafeteria, the one who would decorate the children's ward for every holiday. That Eris was gone, a casualty of the same fire that had consumed her son. This new Eris was a machine of pure intellect, efficient and cold. Her marriage had been another casualty, a structure that could not withstand the earthquake of their shared loss. Her husband, Ben, had wanted to talk, to grieve together, to find solace in memory. But for Eris, memory was a minefield, each happy image a trigger for an agony she could not bear. He had clung to his faith, and she had scorned him for it, seeing it as a betrayal of the reality of their son's death. He eventually left, unable to breathe in the suffocating atmosphere of her unyielding sorrow. Now her life was a sterile loop, the hospital, her empty apartment, a few hours of dreamless, exhausted sleep, and back to the hospital. She was a high priestess in the temple of modern medicine, her only creed the tangible, the provable. But a force she could not measure on any chart, a presence that defied all scientific explanation, was beginning to stir in the quiet, antiseptic corners of her world. It was a whisper preparing to challenge her deafening silence, a subtle fragrance poised to overwhelm the sterile air she breathed. Her fortress of disbelief, built of the strongest materials of grief and reason, was about to be tested by a power far older and more patient than sorrow. The life Eris had built before Leo's death felt like a story she had read about someone else. There were photographs in a box under her bed, sealed with tape, that she refused to open. They showed a smiling woman with warm eyes, her arms wrapped around a small boy with a shock of blonde hair and a mischievous grin. That woman held birthday parties, kissed scraped knees, believed in the tooth fairy, and in a benevolent God who watched over small children. Eris looked at her own reflection in the polished steel of the hospital elevator doors and saw a stranger, a gaunt, pale woman with eyes that had seen the void and found nothing there. Her grief was not a performance, it was a state of being, a low-grade fever that never broke. It informed every diagnosis, every interaction. When she looked at a sick child, she saw Leo. When she spoke to a hopeful mother, she saw her own naive, former self and despised her for her weakness. The memory of his final days was a clinical reel she could not stop playing in her mind. She remembered every lab result, every failed intervention, every desperate consultation with specialists across the country. She had approached his illness as a doctor, a problem to be solved, her mind racing with differential diagnoses while her heart was shattering. Ben had tried to reach her, to hold her hand, to pray with her. "We have to have faith, Ari," he had whispered, his own face awash with tears. She had rounded on him with a fury that shocked them both. "Faith," she had hissed, her voice venomous. "Faith is for people who don't have access to the latest clinical trials. Don't you dare talk to me about faith while my son is dying." Those words had been a wall between them, a wall that had never come down. In the final moments, when all the machines were screaming their failure and the brilliant minds of modern medicine had confessed their defeat, Ben had held Leo's other hand and recited the Lord's Prayer. Eris had simply stared, her mind a blank slate of horror, as she watched the life she had created flicker and die out. The silence that followed the flat line on the monitor was the silence that had taken up permanent residence in her soul. It was a silence she now enforced in her own life, a sterile quiet that kept the chaos of emotion at bay. This meticulous control was how she survived. She lived on black coffee and protein bars, her apartment a minimalist space devoid of personal touches, save for the single perfect orchid she kept on her windowsill. It was a sterile, scientific beauty, a life form she could understand and control. She watered it once a week, measured its food, and it bloomed on schedule, a predictable and obedient thing. It was a stark contrast to the wild, unpredictable, and ultimately fatal biology of her own child. Today, she was dealing with the case of a 7-year-old girl named Sarah, diagnosed with a rare and aggressive form of leukemia. The parents, a young couple named Miller, were clinging to every word she said, their faces masks of terror and desperate hope. "We are praying for a miracle, Doctor," Mrs. Miller had said, her hands twisting a small wooden cross. Eris had felt a familiar surge of cold irritation. "The best chance for a miracle, Mrs. Miller, is a strict adherence to the chemotherapy regimen I have prescribed," she had replied, her tone leaving no room for discussion. She had then turned and walked away, leaving the couple looking as though she had slapped them. Nurse Esther, a veteran of the pediatric ward with kind, crinkled eyes and a faith as sturdy and simple as her orthopedic shoes, had watched the exchange. She approached Eris later at the nurse's station. "They're just scared, Dr. Thorne," Esther said softly, not as a criticism, but as a gentle observation. "Scared people need more than regimens. They need a little kindness." Eris didn't look up from the chart she was reviewing. "Kindness doesn't alter cell counts, Esther. False hope is a cruelty, not a kindness." Esther sighed, a sound of deep, patient sorrow. "I don't know about that, Doctor. Sometimes hope is the only medicine that works." Eris finally looked up, her eyes like chips of ice. "Let me know when you can write a prescription for it." She closed the chart with a sharp snap and walked down the hall, her sensible shoes making sharp, angry clicks on the polished floor, each step a declaration of her disbelief, each click an echo of a heart that had been slammed shut. She was safe in her fortress, and she would let no one in, not a well-meaning nurse, and certainly not the ghost of a god she had pronounced dead and buried. It began in the most innocuous of ways, a sensory anomaly in a world built on sterile precision. Eris was in the on-call room late one night, catching a few moments of rest on the thin, uncomfortable mattress. The room smelled, as it always did, of antiseptic wipes and stale coffee. She had been reviewing the file of a newborn in the NICU with a complex heart defect, the labyrinthine diagrams of the tiny, malformed organ swimming before her tired eyes. She closed them for a moment, and that's when she first noticed it. A scent. Faint, elusive, and utterly out of place. It was the sweet, clean fragrance of fresh lilies. Her eyes snapped open. She sat up, sniffing the air. The smell was gone. It must have been a phantom, she reasoned, an olfactory hallucination triggered by exhaustion. The brain was a notoriously unreliable machine. She had seen patients in states of extreme stress experience all manner of sensory tricks. She was no different. She dismissed it and went back to the file, but her concentration was broken. The memory of the scent lingered, a delicate, fragrant question mark in the sterile equation of her night. A few days later, it happened again. She was standing at the bedside of a young boy recovering from an appendectomy. The room was meticulously clean, the air filtered and recycled. As she was making a note on his chart, the scent returned, stronger this time, an undeniable wave of pure white lilies. It was so real, so present, that she instinctively looked around the room for the source. There were no flowers. Visitors were not permitted to bring flowers into this ward due to allergy concerns. She looked at the boy's mother, who was half asleep in the chair beside the bed. "Do you smell that?" Eris asked, her voice betraying a hint of her confusion. The woman blinked awake. "Smell what, doctor?" The scent was already fading, retreating like a shy tide. "Nothing," Eris said quickly, her cheeks flushing slightly. "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. It was an anomaly, a piece of data that didn't fit. Her mind began to cycle through rational explanations. A new brand of air freshener in the ventilation system. A nurse wearing a particular perfume. A patient's soap. She spent the next day on a quiet, methodical investigation, paying close attention to the ambient smells in every room, on every floor. She found nothing. The hospital smelled of bleach, rubbing alcohol, and illness. There were no lilies. She tried to push the experience from her mind, filing it away under unexplained neurological phenomena, but it had unsettled her. It was a crack in the smooth, hard surface of her reality. That evening, as she was ending her shift, she passed Nurse Esther in the hallway. The old nurse was humming a quiet hymn as she tidied a supply cart. On an impulse Eris did not understand, she stopped. "Esther," she said, her tone more clinical than conversational. "Have you noticed any unusual smells on the ward recently?" Esther stopped her work and looked at Eris, her expression unreadable. She seemed to consider the question carefully. "Unusual how, doctor?" "Floral," Eris said, feeling foolish. "Like lilies." A slow, knowing smile spread across Esther's face. It was not a smile of mockery, but of deep, quiet understanding. "Ah, yes," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "The scent of holiness. I smell it sometimes. Have for years." Eris stared at her, her skepticism warring with a strange, prickling curiosity. "The scent of what?" "Holiness," Esther repeated, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "Some people say it's the calling card of the Blessed Mother. A little sign to let you know she's here, watching over her children." Eris felt a cold wave of disappointment and irritation wash over her. Of course, the simple, unshakable faith of the old nurse would naturally interpret an unexplained scent in the most superstitious way possible. It was a pre-scientific fantasy, a comforting story woven from nothing. "It's probably a new cleaning fluid, Esther," Eris said, her voice clipped and final, shutting down the conversation. "Have a good night." She walked away before Esther could reply. But as she pushed through the doors and out into the cold night air, the nurse's words echoed in her mind. "A little sign to let you know she's here." It was absurd. It was irrational. It was impossible. And yet, for the briefest of moments, as she stood alone in the dark parking lot, she thought she could smell it again, faint and sweet on the cold, sterile wind. The focus of Eris's professional life soon narrowed to a single fragile point. A 6-year-old girl in room 312 named Maya. Maya had been admitted with a high fever and a mysterious rash, her small body racked with a baffling constellation of symptoms that had stumped every specialist Eris had consulted. Her case was a medical puzzle, a direct challenge to Eris's diagnostic acumen, and she threw herself into it with a relentless, almost obsessive focus. For Eris, saving Maya became a proxy war, a battle against the same nameless, faceless enemy that had taken Leo. This time, she would not lose. Maya's parents, the Garcias, were a quiet, devout couple whose faith seemed to be the very scaffolding of their existence. They sat in a constant, prayerful vigil by their daughter's bedside, their hands clasped around rosary beads, their lips moving in silent novenas. A small, laminated icon of a serene-faced Madonna was taped to the headboard of Maya's bed. Eris found their piety both pitiable and profoundly irritating. It was a distraction from the only thing that mattered, the science. "Her inflammatory markers are still dangerously elevated," Eris explained to them one afternoon, pointing to a series of numbers on a chart, her voice devoid of emotion. "The current antibiotic regimen is not having the desired effect. We need to consider a more aggressive, experimental treatment." Mr. Garcia looked up from his prayer book, his eyes red-rimmed but clear. "We trust you, doctor, but we also trust in God. We are praying for his guidance for you, and for his healing for our daughter." Eris had to physically restrain herself from rolling her eyes. "Your prayers are your own affair," she said coolly. "My guidance comes from peer-reviewed medical journals and empirical data. I will need your consent for the new treatment by morning." She felt a grim satisfaction in their crestfallen faces, as if she had scored a point for the side of reason. Yet, the strange phenomena continued, always in the periphery of her awareness, always centered, it seemed, around Maya's room. One night, the primary monitoring machine connected to Maya began to malfunction, its screen flickering, the alarms beeping erratically with false readings. It was a critical piece of equipment, and the on-site technician couldn't fix it. A replacement wouldn't arrive until the next day. Eris felt a surge of cold panic. Without accurate, moment-to-moment data, she was flying blind. As the technician packed up his tools, defeated, Nurse Esther quietly entered the room. She stood by the malfunctioning machine and, thinking no one was watching, placed her hand gently on its casing and bowed her head for a moment. Eris saw the gesture from the hallway and scoffed internally at the futility of it. And then, as Esther removed her hand, the screen flickered one last time and settled into a clear, steady display of Maya's vitals. The alarms fell silent. The technician, who was just walking out, stopped and stared, his mouth agape. "What did you do?" he asked Esther. Esther just smiled her serene smile. Sometimes these old machines just need a gentle touch. The technician checked the connections, ran a diagnostic, and could find no explanation. The machine worked perfectly for the rest of the night. Eris watched the whole scene unfold, her mind refusing to connect the prayerful gesture with the outcome. It was a coincidence, a loose wire, a power surge. There were 100 possible explanations, all of them rooted in physics and electricity. Yet, the event left another small crack in her armor of certainty. The most unsettling event was yet to come. It happened late, well after midnight, as she was walking the quiet, darkened corridors of the pediatric ward. The silence on the floor at that hour was usually absolute, broken only by the hum of machines and the soft snores of sleeping children. As she passed the darkened playroom, she heard it, a sound that stopped her heart. It was a child's giggle, a clear, happy, bubbling laugh, and it sounded, with a terrifying, gut-wrenching familiarity, exactly like Leo. She froze, her hand flying to her mouth, a strangled sob caught in her throat. The playroom was dark and empty. She could see its vacant shapes through the glass panel in the door. No child was awake at this hour. No television was on. The sound had come from nowhere. It was a hallucination, she told herself fiercely, her mind scrambling for the safety of a diagnosis. Auditory hallucination, brought on by stress, grief, and sleep deprivation. It was a classic symptom. She was the patient, not the observer. She leaned against the wall, her heart hammering against her ribs, forcing herself to breathe. It was not real. Leo was gone. His laugh was just a ghost in the damaged wiring of her brain. But the sound had been so pure, so real. It was the sound of her son chasing bubbles in the backyard, the sound of her own lost happiness. She pushed herself off the wall and hurried to the nurse's station, her composure shattered. She needed a distraction, a chart to read, a problem to solve, anything to silence the echo of that impossible laughter. The hospital chaplain, Father Michael, was a kind, thoughtful man in his early 50s, with a background in psychology that made him more of a spiritual counselor than a dogmatic priest. He had tried to reach out to Eris several times since Leo's death, leaving gentle notes, offering a cup of coffee, but she had rebuffed him at every turn. To her, he was a purveyor of the very poison she had purged from her system. He represented the thoughts and prayers, platitudes that offered no real solace, the empty promises of a heaven she no longer believed existed. He found her one morning in the hospital's small, rarely used library, staring blankly at a page in a medical textbook. He approached cautiously, as one might approach a wounded animal. "Eris," he said softly, "I heard about the Garcia girl. Esther tells me it's a difficult case." Eris didn't look up. "All my cases are difficult, Michael. Disease is, by its nature, difficult." "Of course," he said, pulling up a chair and sitting uninvited. "I was speaking more of the parents. Their faith is being tested." "Their faith is irrelevant to her treatment," Eris said, her voice sharp. "I'm treating a systemic infection, not a spiritual crisis." Father Michael sighed. "Can't you be treating both? I've seen faith pull patients through when medicine alone was not enough. The spirit and the body are not so separate as we sometimes pretend." This was the opening Eris had been waiting for, a chance to unleash the cold, intellectual fury she kept bottled inside. She finally closed the book and turned her full attention to him, her eyes blazing with a surgeon's intensity. "That is a dangerous and offensive sentiment, Michael. Are you suggesting that if a patient dies, it's because their faith wasn't strong enough? That my son died because I didn't pray hard enough?" The words hung in the air, heavy and painful. Father Michael flinched, but he held her gaze. No, Eris. Of course not. I would never suggest such a thing. I am saying that in the midst of suffering, faith can be a source of profound strength, a way to find meaning when everything seems meaningless. There is no meaning, she shot back, her voice rising. There is only biology. Random, cruel, meaningless biology. My son's cells were attacked by a virus. His organs failed. He died. It wasn't a test. It wasn't part of a divine plan. It was a biological event. To assign it some grand, spiritual purpose is an insult to the brutal reality of it. It's a lie we tell children to make them less afraid of the dark, and we are not children. He listened patiently, his face a mask of compassion, which only infuriated her more. I understand your anger, Eris. You have every right to be angry. Don't psychoanalyze me, she snapped. And don't tell me you understand. You can't. No one can. She stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. I have a real patient to attend to, one I might actually be able to save with science, not with platitudes. She walked out, leaving him sitting in the quiet library. But her intellectual victory felt hollow. Her own words, meant to be a shield, had felt like self-inflicted wounds. The truth was she was terrified. The scent of lilies, the self-repairing machine, the ghost of her son's laughter. These were phenomena that her science could not explain, cracks in the foundation of her carefully constructed worldview. She was clinging to her disbelief with the same desperation that the Garcias clung to their prayers. It was her faith, the faith of a nihilist, and it was the only thing holding her together. To let go of it would be to admit that there was a world beyond her understanding, a power beyond her control. And after losing her son, the illusion of control was the only thing she had left. Maya's condition, meanwhile, was deteriorating rapidly. The experimental treatment was failing. The infection was spreading, and her small body was beginning to shut down. Each new lab result was a blow, each reading on the monitor a step closer to the abyss. Eris worked with a grim, sleepless determination, poring over every piece of data, consulting with immunologists and infectious disease experts around the clock. She was fighting a losing battle, and she knew it. The hospital corridors began to feel like a recurring nightmare, the same path she had walked a year ago. The beeping machines were the same, the worried faces of the nurses were the same, the impending sense of doom was the same. She was watching her failure with Leo play out all over again, and she was just as powerless now as she had been then. The fortress of her intellect was crumbling, not from an assault from the outside, but from the relentless, internal pressure of her own impotence. The crisis came on a Tuesday night, under the harsh, unforgiving glare of fluorescent lights. An alarm began to blare from room 312, a high, piercing shriek that cut through the relative quiet of the ward. Maya was crashing. Her blood pressure had plummeted, and her breathing was shallow and rapid. Eris was there in an instant, a team of nurses and residents swarming in behind her. The room, which had been a quiet space of prayerful vigil, was transformed into a chaotic theater of emergency medicine. "Push 1 amp of AP," Eris commanded, her voice sharp and clear, cutting through the noise. "Someone get me a crash cart. I need a new arterial line now." She moved with an almost preternatural calm, her hands steady, her mind a supercomputer processing a dozen streams of data at once. This was her element, the place where she was in control. Here, there were no ghosts, no mysterious scents, only physiology and pharmacology. For the next hour, they fought. They pushed drugs, administered oxygen, and worked frantically to stabilize the small, failing body on the bed. The Garcias were ushered out into the hallway, their faces ashen, their prayers now desperate, frantic whispers. Eris could see them through the glass, clinging to each other, their eyes fixed on the controlled chaos inside the room. Nurse Esther was in the room, her role less medical and more spiritual. She was a silent, calming presence, handing instruments to Eris, her face serene, her lips moving in a silent prayer of her own. For a moment, Eris felt a flicker of grudging respect. In the midst of the storm, Esther was an anchor. But it wasn't enough. The machines told the unpitying truth. Maya's body was not responding. Her heart rate was erratic, her oxygen saturation was falling into a critical range. They were losing her. Every medical intervention, every tool in Eris's considerable arsenal, was failing. The science had reached its limit. The feeling was sickeningly familiar. It was the same cold, metallic taste of helplessness that she had felt in Leo's room. The dawning horror that despite all her knowledge, all her training, she was just a witness to the inexorable march of death. "There's nothing more we can do," a young resident said, his voice cracking with the strain. Her pressure won't hold. Eris didn't respond. She stared at the monitor, at the chaotic green lines that represented the last flickers of a child's life. He was right. She had run out of moves. The battle was over. The silence that fell over the room was heavier than the preceding chaos. It was the silence of defeat. Eris slowly, mechanically, took off her gloves. She looked at the faces of her team, a collection of exhausted, crestfallen young doctors and nurses. She had led them into a battle they could not win. "Thank you, everyone," she said, her voice a hollow whisper. You can clear out." They filed out of the room, their shoulders slumped, leaving Eris alone with Esther and the dying child. Now came the worst part. The part she had performed once before, the part that had broken her. She had to go out into the hallway and tell two loving parents that their world was about to end. She had to extinguish the last, flickering flame of their hope. She walked toward the door, each step feeling as if she were wading through wet concrete. She could see the Garcias through the glass, their faces turning toward her, their eyes wide with a desperate, pleading question. She saw in their faces her own face from a year ago. She saw Ben's. And she couldn't do it. She couldn't be the harbinger of that particular apocalypse again. The strength, the composure, the cold, professional shell she had built around herself, dissolved in an instant. She turned away from the door, a choked sob escaping her lips, and fled. She didn't go to the nurse's station or her office. She ran down the hall to the empty on-call room, the same room where she had first smelled the lilies, and slammed the door behind her. She slid down the wall and onto the floor, the sterile linoleum cold against her skin. The fortress was breached. The dam had broken. All the grief, all the anger, all the pain she had suppressed for a year came roaring to the surface. She curled into a ball and wept, not with quiet tears, but with deep, animal sounds of pure, absolute agony. It was the sound of a soul that had been utterly and completely broken. It was the sound of surrender. In the small, dark, anonymous room, Eris was no longer a doctor. She was just a woman, a mother, stripped of all her defenses, her intellect, her pride. She lay on the floor, her body convulsing with sobs, the carefully constructed edifice of her life in ruins around her. She had failed. She had failed Maya, she had failed the Garcias, and most painfully, she had relived her failure with Leo. Her science, her only god, had proven to be a false idol, powerless in the face of death. She had nothing left. No hope, no faith, no answers. It was in this moment of absolute emptiness, of complete and utter spiritual bankruptcy, that the atmosphere in the room began to change. The first thing she noticed was the scent. It returned, not as a fleeting, ghostly whisper, but as a powerful, undeniable presence. The room filled with the overwhelming, beautiful fragrance of 1,000 fresh lilies, a scent so pure and potent it seemed to displace the very air. It was not a hallucination. It was a physical reality, a sacred perfume that enveloped her, seeping into her senses, calming the violent storm within her. Then came the light. It did not come from the single, high window or from under the door. It bloomed from within the room itself, a soft, gentle, golden-white luminescence that was not bright or harsh, but profoundly peaceful. It was like the light of a dawn that carried no heat, only warmth. It bathed the small room in a holy glow, transforming the sterile, functional space into a sanctuary. Eris's sobbing subsided into quiet, hitched breaths. She slowly uncurled herself, lifting her head, her tear-filled eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. She was not alone. She could see no one, no figure, no form. But she felt a presence. It was an intelligence, a consciousness, that filled the room, as tangible as the floor beneath her. It was feminine, ancient, and its primary characteristic, the thing that radiated from it like the light itself, was an overwhelming, unconditional love. It was the love of a mother, a universal, cosmic, all-encompassing maternal love that was directed entirely at her. It was a love that knew her completely, knew her pain, her anger, her guilt, and did not judge her for it. It simply loved her. In the heart of this luminous, fragrant silence, a thought entered her mind. It was not her own thought. Its texture, its tone, its profound serenity was utterly foreign to the chaos of her own consciousness. It was a voice that spoke not to her ears, but directly to her soul. You did not fail him. The words were simple, but they struck her with the force of a revelation. All the guilt she had carried for a year, the secret, terrible belief that if she had just been a better doctor, a smarter scientist, she could have saved Leo, it was a burden she had placed upon herself. The presence in the room was lifting it from her. He was not yours to keep. He was only yours to love. Tears began to stream down Eris's face again, but these were not the tears of anguish and despair. They were tears of release, of catharsis, of a grief so profound it was becoming a form of grace. She felt the tight, agonizing knot of guilt in her chest begin to dissolve, washed away by this tide of love and absolution. Let him go, my child. Let yourself be healed. She closed her eyes, no longer fighting, no longer resisting. She surrendered to the presence, to the light, to the love. She felt as if she were being held, cradled, comforted by an unseen, holy mother. She finally allowed herself to feel the full depth of her loss, not as a medical failure, but as a human tragedy, a sacred sorrow. And in that sorrow, she found not an empty void, as she had feared, but a deep and abiding peace. The light and the scent held for a timeless moment, and then, as gently as they had arrived, they began to recede, leaving her in the quiet darkness of the room once more. But the room was no longer the same, because she was no longer the same. The broken woman on the floor had been remade. The silence in her soul, once a symbol of God's absence, was now filled with the resonant echo of his love. She had entered the room with nothing left to lose, and had been given everything. Eris remained on the floor for several minutes, the profound peace of the encounter settling deep into her bones. She felt light. The crushing weight of a year's worth of grief and guilt had been lifted. She stood up, her movements slow and deliberate. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass of a framed medical diagram on the wall. The woman who looked back was still tear-stained, her face pale with exhaustion, but her eyes were different. The hard, brittle ice was gone, replaced by a deep, clear stillness, like a pool of water after a storm. She walked out of the on-call room and back down the hallway toward room 312. She moved not with the frantic energy of a doctor rushing to an emergency, but with a calm, quiet purpose. She was no longer going to fight a battle, she was going to bear witness. When she entered Maya's room, the scene was one of quiet, heartbreaking vigil. The medical team was gone. Nurse Esther was standing by the bed, gently stroking Maya's forehead. The Garcias were there, Mr. Garcia with his arm around his wife's shoulders, both of them weeping silently as they watched the faltering lines on the monitor. They looked up as Eris entered, their faces etched with the dread of anticipating the words she had come to say. But Eris didn't speak of death. She didn't offer statistics or medical explanations. She walked over to them, and for the first time in a year, she initiated a human touch, placing her hand gently on Mrs. Garcia's arm. "I am so sorry," she said, and the words were not a professional condolence, but a deep, heartfelt expression of shared sorrow. "I know this pain." Mrs. Garcia looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not a cold, detached physician, but a fellow mother, a woman who understood the unique agony of watching a child suffer. She collapsed into Eris's arms, and Eris held her, offering the comfort she herself had so long denied. For several minutes, they stood there, three adults united in their powerlessness and grief, a small community of sorrow under the flickering lights of the failing machines. Eris was no longer there as a doctor who had failed, but as a human being who was present. And as they stood in that quiet, prayerful, surrendered silence, something began to happen. It was Esther who noticed it first. Her eyes, which had been closed in prayer, opened and fixed on the monitor. "Doctor," she whispered, her voice trembling. Eris looked up at the screen. The chaotic, erratic line of Maya's heart rate was beginning to smooth out. The jagged peaks and valleys were becoming a steady, rhythmic beat. Her blood pressure, which had been dangerously low, began to creep upward, number by number. Her oxygen saturation, which had been in the low 80s, ticked up to 90, then 91, 92. It was impossible. There was no medical reason for it. They were administering no drugs, performing no interventions. Maya's body was stabilizing on its own. Eris stared, her scientific mind struggling to comprehend what her eyes were seeing. The Garcias followed her gaze, and a gasp of disbelief escaped Mr. Garcia's lips. A new kind of silence fell over the room, the silence of awe. Over the next hour, Maya's vitals continued to improve, slowly, steadily, miraculously. By dawn, she was out of immediate danger. Her fever had begun to recede. She was still a very sick little girl, but she had stepped back from the precipice. She was going to live. The news spread through the hospital like wildfire. The doctors and nurses who had been on the code team the night before came by to look at the chart, to see the impossible numbers with their own eyes. They spoke in hushed tones, using words like inexplicable and spontaneous remission. But Eris knew. It was not inexplicable. It was a miracle. A quiet, gentle miracle born not of a frantic fight, but of a quiet surrender. The ripple effect of that night spread beyond Maya's recovery. The change in Dr. Thorne was, to many, an even greater miracle. The cold, aloof physician was gone. In her place was a woman of profound empathy and quiet strength. She still practiced medicine with the same brilliance and precision, but now it was tempered with a deep, abiding compassion. She learned to listen not just to her patients' bodies, but to their spirits. She held hands. She met eyes. She understood, now, that healing was a mystery far greater than the sum of its chemical and biological parts. She had learned that true authority comes not from knowledge, but from love. In the weeks and months that followed, St. Jude's Pediatric Hospital became a different place. The transformation of its most brilliant and difficult doctor had a profound effect on the culture of the entire ward. Eris's newfound compassion was infectious. She started a support group for parents of critically ill children, creating a space for them to share their fears and hopes. She began to work closely with Father Michael, no longer seeing him as an adversary, but as a vital part of the healing team, a doctor for the soul. Their conversations were no longer debates, but dialogues, explorations of the mysterious intersection of science and faith. She became the doctor that young residents aspired to be, not just a master of the science, but a master of the art of healing. Maya Garcia made a full, astonishing recovery. Her mysterious illness faded as quickly as it had appeared, leaving no trace, a medical anomaly that would be written up in journals as a case for the ages. But the Garcias and Esther and Eris, they knew it was more than an anomaly. It was a gift. Eris never spoke explicitly about what had happened to her in the on-call room. It was a sacred, personal event, a secret covenant she held in her heart. But she didn't need to speak of it. People saw it in her eyes, felt it in her presence. They saw a woman who had walked through the deepest fire and had emerged not scarred, but illuminated. Her own healing was a quiet, ongoing process. She reconnected with her ex-husband, Ben. She called him one evening, and for the first time, they talked about Leo not with anger or blame, but with a shared, gentle sorrow. They wept together over the phone, and it was a cleansing, healing rain. Their romantic relationship was over, but their shared love for their son, once a source of division, now became a bridge of deep, abiding friendship. The final step in her journey came on a bright, crisp autumn afternoon, a little over a year after her world had been remade. She drove to the cemetery where Leo was buried. She had not been there since the funeral. The place had represented the finality of her failure. But today, she walked through the gates with a sense of peace, not dread. She found the small, simple headstone. Leo Thorne, beloved son. She knelt on the grass, a single, perfect white lily in her hand. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and fallen leaves. She traced the letters of his name with her finger. "Hello, my sweet boy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, but not with despair. "I miss you. I miss you every minute of every day. But I'm okay. I finally understand. It was never my job to keep you. It was just my privilege to love you." She placed the lily at the base of the stone. She stayed there for a long time, not praying in the traditional sense, but simply being present, sharing the quiet afternoon with the memory of her son. The sun was warm on her back. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves in the trees above. And as she finally stood to leave, she looked at the name on the stone one last time, and for the first time in 2 years, a genuine smile touched her lips. It was a smile of peace, of acceptance, of a love that had transcended even death. The doctor had been healed. The mother had found her peace. The woman who had lost her faith had found something far greater, a profound, experiential knowledge of a love that never, ever lets go. The story of Dr. Eris Thorne is a profound reminder that our deepest wounds can often become the very source of our greatest strength. It is a testament to the fact that healing is not about forgetting what we have lost, but about learning to carry it with grace, love, and a renewed sense of purpose. Her journey from the cold, sterile world of pure reason to the warm, mysterious embrace of faith teaches us that the human spirit and the physical body are inextricably linked. True healing addresses both. It is in our moments of greatest vulnerability, when we finally lay down our pride and our anger and admit our own powerlessness, that we become open to a grace we could never have achieved on our own. Eris had to be completely broken before she could be made whole. Her story illuminates a powerful truth, that a loving, divine presence is always with us, especially in our darkest hours. It does not always prevent our suffering, but it offers a path through it, communicating in quiet, personal miracles, a mysterious scent, an unexplainable recovery, a comforting voice that speaks directly to the soul. It is a presence that waits patiently for us to stop fighting, to stop demanding, and to simply listen. We believe that sharing narratives of such profound transformation helps us all to better understand our own journeys of loss and recovery. It connects us to the universal human experience of seeking light in the darkness. If this story of a mother's path from devastating grief to profound peace has moved you, please consider helping us spread this message of enduring hope. Like this video to show your support, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that explore the intersection of faith, healing, and the human heart. Please share this video with anyone who may be struggling with loss or a crisis of faith. You may be providing them with a timely reminder that they are not alone, that their pain is seen, and that surrender is not an act of defeat, but the first step toward a miraculous, grace-filled healing. Thank you for watching, and may you always be aware of the gentle, healing presence that surrounds you.